In the middle of World War II, hundreds of aircraft flew straight into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Broad daylight, no stealth, no guarantee of survival. Many of them came back torn apart. Yet this gamble reshaped how wars would be fought forever. At the center of this story is a machine built on a bold idea: that industrial wars could be won not on the ground, but from the sky. A bomber designed to fly higher, farther, and fight its way through enemy defenses alone. It promised precision, endurance, and dominance. But combat has a way of exposing the gap between theory and reality. How did this aircraft earn a reputation for being nearly indestructible? And what moment forced a complete rethink of American air power? To understand that, we need to go back to the ideas that created the B-17 Flying Fortress in the first place. The origins of the B-17 Flying Fortress lie in the unresolved lessons of the First World War. After 1908, military planners faced a central problem. Modern industrial wars were becoming too large, too costly, and too slow to be decided solely on the ground. Trenches had proven how difficult it was to break a defended front. Air power emerged as a possible solution. If aircraft could bypass armies and strike directly at factories, railways, and cities, future wars might be decided by destroying an enemy's ability and will to fight rather than by grinding advances across battlefields. In the interwar years, this idea hardened into doctrine. American military thinkers were deeply influenced by air power theorists such as Julio who argued that bombers could fly over front lines, devastate industrial infrastructure, and collapse civilian morale. The belief took hold that future wars would be won in the air. This thinking was famously summarized by the phrase attributed to British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin: "The bomber will always get through." For U.S. planners, the question was not whether bombers would penetrate enemy defenses, but how to build a bomber capable of doing so decisively and repeatedly. That strategic belief led directly to a formal requirement. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a request for a new multi-engine Bomber 1, with greater range, higher speed, and heavier payload than anything then in service. Boeing's response was Project 299. Designed as a 4-engine heavy bomber at a time when 2 engines were still the norm, the aircraft promised something radical: long-range, high-altitude, daylight precision bombing deep into enemy territory. The prototype first flew in July 1935, demonstrating its ability to travel over 2,000 miles non-stop. A performance that immediately impressed military observers. From the beginning, the B-17 was built around a specific American gamble. Unlike the British, who turned toward nighttime area bombing after suffering heavy losses, the United States committed itself to daylight precision bombing. The logic was simple but risky. Bombing during the day allowed crews to see and identify targets, making attacks more accurate and militarily effective. This strategy relied heavily on the secret Norton bomb sight, a complex gyroscopic device that promised near surgical accuracy when used by a skilled bomber. In theory, a formation of B-17s flying in daylight could cripple key industrial targets while minimizing wasted bombs. The aircraft's nickname emerged from this same logic. During its public debut in 1935, observers noted the bomber's heavy defensive armament, multiple machine gun positions covering nearly every approach angle. A reporter famously described it as a flying fortress, a phrase Boeing quickly embraced and trademarked. The name carried both symbolism and intent. This was a bomber designed to defend itself, to fight its way in and out of hostile skies. Early impressions cemented the B-17 not just as a machine, but as a statement of America's confidence that technology, doctrine, and firepower could dominate the future of air warfare. If this story is changing the way you see air power, take a moment to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because now, the Flying Fortress is about to face the skies that will decide its fate. The theory behind the B-17 was ambitious. Combat would test whether it could survive reality. That test began in August 1942 when American B-17s carried out their first combat mission over occupied Europe. On August 17th, 12 Flying Fortresses attacked the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. It was a small raid, carefully chosen, but symbolically massive. For the first time, American bombers flew a daylight mission over Europe, challenging both German defenses and long-standing assumptions about air warfare. As American involvement expanded, the B-17 became the backbone of the U.S. 8th Air Force, operating from airfields in England. From there, bomber formations began pushing deeper into occupied Europe and eventually into Germany itself. The aircraft flew at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, where the air was thin, temperatures brutal, and oxygen masks essential. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 and, depending on the version, up to 1350 caliber machine guns positioned across the nose, waist, belly, tail, and dorsal turrets. To survive, B-17s did not fly alone. They flew in tight defensive formations known as combat boxers. These stacked and staggered formations allowed overlapping fields of fire, creating walls of defensive gunfire against attacking fighters. In theory, no single bomber was isolated. Every aircraft was part of a collective fortress in the sky. In practice, this demanded strict discipline. Breaking formation meant vulnerability not only for one crew, but for the entire group. Early missions revealed a harsh pattern. As raids increased in frequency and depth, German fighter opposition intensified, and losses steadily climbed. The B-17 was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: penetrate enemy airspace in daylight, but the cost of proving that theory was becoming painfully clear. If the B-17 earned respect, it earned it through survival. Again and again, aircraft returned to base in conditions that defied expectation. Wings were torn by flak, engines burned or fell silent. Control surfaces were yet many of these bombers stayed airborne long enough to bring their crews home. These repeated returns transformed engineering into legend. The B-17 structure was central to this reputation. Its rugged airframe, combined with 4 engines instead of 2, gave it redundancy. Losing one engine or even 2 did not automatically mean loss of the aircraft. Crews trusted the fortress because it gave them a margin between damage and disaster. Over time, stories circulated through airfields of planes, landing with massive holes in their fuselages, or entire sections missing. Each damaged aircraft that returned safely reinforced the belief that the B-17 could absorb punishment like no other bomber. This trust mattered psychologically. Crews flew long missions, knowing they would face intense flak and fighter attacks. Confidence in the aircraft did not eliminate fear, but it shaped morale. Many airmen regarded the B-17 as more forgiving than other heavy bombers, particularly when compared implicitly to the B-4 Liberator, which offered greater range and payload, but was often seen as less resilient under fire. The Flying Fortress began to acquire metaphors that reflected this perception. It was described as a tank in the air, or a battleship of the sky. These analogies were not technical assessments. They were emotional truths. The aircraft symbolized endurance, an airborne warship sailing through hostile skies. Every battered fortress that limped back to England became visual proof that the bomber could take punishment and still fulfill its purpose. This accumulation of survival stories did more than inspire crews. It shaped public perception and reinforced American confidence in daylight strategic bombing. The myth of the B-17 was not born from propaganda. Alone it was built, rivet by rivet, from damaged metal that refused to fall. But even fortresses have limits. In 1943, American planners pushed the B-17 deeper into Germany, targeting critical industrial nodes beyond the reach of consistent fighter escort. One of the most ambitious targets was Schweinfurt, a center of German ball-bearing production. These factories were essential to German industry and military production. Destroying them, it was believed, could cripple the German war effort. The second major raid on Schweinfurt, on October 14, 1943, exposed the vulnerability of the entire doctrine. That day became known as Black Thursday. German fighters and air defenses inflicted devastating losses on the bomber formations. For all its guns, armor, and discipline, the B-17 could not survive, unescorted against concentrated, well-coordinated fighter attacks. Losses were described as unacceptable not just statistically, but strategically. This was the turning point. The long-held belief that tightly packed bomber formations could fight their way to any target on their own collapsed. The Flying Fortress was durable, but it was not invincible. The crises forced American commanders to confront a hard truth. Endurance alone was not enough. Without protection, even the strongest bomber could be overwhelmed. The solution came not from redesigning the bomber, but from changing the system around it. Long-range escort fighters, most notably the P-51 Mustang, began accompanying B-17 formations deep into Germany. For the first time, bombers were protected for the entire mission, not just part of it. This transformed the air war. With escort fighters suppressing German interceptors, the B-17 could finally operate as intended. Deep penetration raids resumed in early 1944, and the cumulative pressure on German industry intensified. The Flying Fortress played a critical role in weakening aircraft production, oil facilities, and transportation networks. This air supremacy proved decisive in preparing the skies over Normandy for the D-Day landings in June 1944. The B-17 did not win the air war alone, but, once integrated into a system of escort and coordination, it became a central instrument of Allied dominance in the air. By the end of World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress had become more than a weapon. It had become a system, a symbol, and a legacy. Produced on an industrial scale, the aircraft reflected America's ability to combine technology, doctrine, and mass production into a single strategic instrument. From fewer than 200 aircraft at the start of the war, production surged to more than 12,000 B-17s, which ultimately served in every theater of the conflict. No other American aircraft dropped more bombs during the war, and none became more closely associated with the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. As the war progressed, however, aviation technology continued to evolve. The B-17 was eventually surpassed by the B-29, a larger, more advanced bomber designed for longer ranges and heavier payloads. By 1945, the Flying Fortress was already becoming obsolete for frontline combat. Many aircraft were scrapped, while others found secondary roles as transports, reconnaissance platforms, search and rescue aircraft, or even remotely controlled drones. Yet obsolescence did not erase significance. The B-17 had already fulfilled its historical role. What truly defined the B-17 was not just what it destroyed, but what it represented. It embodied the American commitment to daylight precision bombing, a doctrine that shaped modern air warfare. Its reputation for durability was not myth alone. It was built from repeated evidence of aircraft returning despite catastrophic damage. Each surviving crew reinforced the idea that air power could be both relentless and resilient. The Flying Fortress demonstrated that strategic bombing required more than machines. It required integration with escort fighters, disciplined formations, and overwhelming industrial support. Today, the B-17 endures as a cultural and historical icon, preserved in museums and, in rare cases, still flying. It remains a physical reminder of an era when control of the sky became essential to victory. The B-17 did not simply participate in World War II. Air warfare helped define it, by proving that endurance, doctrine, and scale could turn vulnerability into dominance. The Flying Fortress changed how wars would be fought from the air forever.